Russia shows it is not only a terrorist state, but it is a nuclear terrorist state. It has taken Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, the biggest in Europe, as a hostage of its military action in Ukraine. Hello and welcome to the Explaining Ukraine podcast, a podcast by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. My co-host is Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Hello, Tanya.
Hello.
So we are talking today about the major events and trends over the past week, the week from the 8th of August until the 13th of August. We will talk about the major events in this war, in this Russian invasion. Before we start, let me remind you that you can support us on patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We're spending the majority of your support to help people affected by this war in our volunteer trips. So Tanya, what were the key events in this war and in Ukraine during this week?
Well, maybe let's start with this situation on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, because maybe the most challenging one for Ukraine, and not only for Ukraine but for the whole continent. During this week we've seen many shelling close to this plant, in fact inside this plant, not exactly the plant but the administrative buildings. And we've also observed Russia accusing Ukraine of this shelling, and we understand that, and we also observe this kind of chantage coming from Russia, stating that if you counterattack, we should understand that in the context when Ukrainian army is starting its counteroffensive in the south, and the Russians, they try their best to keep the south, and they are using this plant in order to keep Ukrainians out. And
let's locate where this nuclear plant is. It's not very far from Zaporizhzhia, one of the big Ukrainian industrial cities. It's rather to the south, so it is really part of the southern Ukraine. It's on the bank of the Dnipro River, and it is near actually in the town called Energodar,
yeah.
which we can translate into English as the gift of energy. So and
let's explain that this nuclear plant was seized by Russians in the beginning of March, maybe during the first week of their full-scale invasion. If you look at Energodar as a city, you will understand that this city was founded around this plant. The population before the war was around 50,000 people. And at that very moment, there are around 20,000 people, because a lot of people were trying to flee the city because it was occupied. But at the same time, just to imagine how big this plant is, just imagine 11,000 people are working at this station. So now we can say that half of the population present in Energodar, they are working at the station. And the problem is that these people are taken like hostages by Russian army. Most of them are not able to leave the station, to leave the plant. They are working there. Sometimes they are going downstairs somewhere in the undergrounds, but they are forced to continue their work by Russian army. And Russian army, they are already using this plant as a place for their military vehicles, arms and all kind of military stuff. So this situation is extremely dangerous, even if we do understand. So for Ukrainian army, situation is quite clear. They will not shell directly the plant, because everybody understands here in Ukraine how dangerous it could be. But at the same time, there is always a risk when this is a war, and they can try, for example, to provoke with the shelling. And let's also explain that just in face of Energodar, across river Dnieper, you have a town called Nikopol, and Nikopol is shelled severely for many weeks already. I mean, residential areas, houses, and the only reason of this shelling, because there is no way for Russians to advance on Nikopol because there is a river and no bridge. But the only reason for them to shell constantly this Nikopol is that they try to provoke Ukrainian forces to react, to respond, and then maybe to fix this Ukrainian fire, and then to present it like a proof of that Ukrainians are creating this nuclear danger.
Yeah, of course, and the Russians are blaming Ukrainians for attacking its own nuclear power plant. But I mean, the question is who has taken it as a military object? Of course, Russians has taken it as a hostage, as a military object. Let's remind our listeners that this is not the first time they did with the nuclear facility. They also have done it in February, March with Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Chernobyl nuclear power plant, everybody knows it as a place of a huge nuclear accident, disaster in 1986, but it is not operational anymore. So the danger was that the shells could hit, for example, underground nuclear waste storage facilities, which are still underground under big layer of concrete and more or less protected. But now we are talking about the operational, the functional energy station, nuclear energy station, the biggest in Europe, the second or third largest in the world. And Russians are taking it as a military object.
But and solutions. So, what could be a solution for that? So, Ukraine is calling for MAGATE agency to interact.
IAEA, it is called. MAGATE, it's in Ukrainian, International Atomic Energy Agency.
Just to interfere, to help, to install a kind of control over the plant, and the Russians are not providing access, even if they say they don't deny it. But at least another option proposed by Ukraine, but also supported by many partners of Ukraine, namely by United States, is a kind of creation of demilitarized zone around the station, around the plant. It means that all kind of army should be out of the plant. But at that very moment, we don't see any moves in this direction. So Russians are here, are there. They're trying to continue their game, and at that moment, no progress.
This is why we are calling it terrorism, because it is really taking something very valuable as a hostage.
Very dangerous.
And very dangerous. They're taking people, but they're taking also the nuclear facility. And that's something that we need to all understand. That this is taking something as a hostage, and like a terrorist which takes civilians as a hostage and says if something goes wrong, he or she will blow it up. That's exactly what is happening. And we've heard a statement from, I think, one of the Russian generals or commanders that Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant will be either Russian or nobody's. So if it is not Russian, they are ready really to blow it up. And the consequences will be enormous. There will be much bigger consequences than Chernobyl disaster.
Frankly, I don't think that they are really capable to blow it up, because it looks like it'll be the end for them as well. It's a kind of suicide behavior in a way, because if only, let's imagine, this explosion will take place, it will be a disaster not only for Ukraine, but also for Russia. It depends on the direction of the wind, maybe for Russia, maybe for Belarus, maybe for Europe. It will be much bigger disaster than Chernobyl, because this plant is bigger than Chernobyl. So I frankly don't think that this is a real plan. But the real danger is that when you have military base on the nuclear plant, anything can happen, because they can shell. There will be kind of accident. So it could be really dangerous. The whole presence, the only presence of military on the plant is unacceptable.
And there was one advantage of this nuclear terrorism compared to a typical nuclear strike. If there is a nuclear strike, everybody knows who has made this strike. If they make an explosion on this plant, they can again blame the Ukrainians, say that it was a Ukrainian rocket or Ukrainian shell, whatever. So they will continue, doing something and pointing at Ukrainians, blaming Ukrainians for doing this. And this is the most horrible thing in these Russian tactics, I think, since 2014. And what we call их там нет. They are not there, they are not present there, or it's not us. And unfortunately, in this war, these tactics, it is used many times. It has been used when Russians killed Ukrainian prisoners of war, killing about 50 people and over 70 wounded in Olenivka recently, and can be repeated now.
Mm-hmm. So to sum it up, there was a Security Council of the United Nations Assembly discussing the subject during this week. Unfortunately, the conclusions were not strong at all. So they were just recommending both parts to create this demilitarized zone, but it doesn't oblige, in fact, Russia. And unfortunately, on the ground, we don't see any positive development of this story, and sure we'll be following this story during next weeks.
So I think, unfortunately, we are witnessing the weakness, the enormous weakness of the international institutions. We have talked about this in our previous weekly digest when we have talked about Amnesty International. I think the problem is that the logic of these institutions is to some extent accept that the wars are inevitable, that they will happen, but to make it in a way that the law will restrict the wars. The law will make a framework for the wars, the humanitarian law, the energy law, etc., etc. But to look at this, to think as this as is means complete misunderstanding of what Russians are trying to do, because Russians are trying to not to proceed with a certain violence which will be restricted by a certain law, but to proceed with violence that will destroy this law. So it's not the law that frames the violence, creates the context for the violence. It's the violence that frames the law, that creates the context for the law.
Absolutely right.
And their tactics is to ruin the international system of rules, and to say that, okay, we are now entering this anarchy and we will set up the new rules. I think, and this is something they have been pronouncing very repeatedly in their talk shows, and they want to change the rules of the game. And in order to change the rules of the game, they need to destroy the existing rules.
Mm-hmm. That's it. So let's continue. So another important subject during this week was surely now these strikes, or maybe not strikes, but at least explosions or any kind of other objective cause, which caused the destruction of an air base in Novofedorivka. Novofedorivka, a village close to a town called Saki in Crimea, more than 200 kilometers from the front line in the south. And this was something extremely surprising for everybody, for Ukrainians, but also for Russians and for the international community, because for the first time from the very beginning of this full-scale invasion, we see that something happens very profoundly in Russia, but not in Russia, but in Crimea. But we should understand that Russia always presented Crimea like a sacred place and like a very secure place from their point of view. They were talking about their air defense, about all this. Crimea was highly militarized during these 8 years of occupation. And it happens. And we don't know exactly what happened. There are many versions of that. Some are saying about maybe missiles. And maybe missiles arrived to this base. Maybe there was a kind of explosion. Maybe some other reasons. But the problem is that that was a kind of a coincidence in time, because there were no Fedorivka and some other bases in Crimea which exploded the same day, like in Oleksiivka and another village. And Ukrainian army, they didn't confirm that there was their plan or their objective, so we are still we are still not sure what happened, but it's quite clear. And the same day, Volodymyr Zelensky made a statement saying that for Ukraine, the deoccupation of Crimea is a must, and the war will end with the deoccupation of Crimea. So we should interpret that in that way.
And that's very interesting, of course, when both sides deny that it was a Ukrainian strike. Russians have been denying it from the very beginning, and there was this
Like with Moscow.
statement by Russian propagandists, and it is now has become a meme. For example, from this notorious Margarita Simonyan, the head of RT, who initially wrote on her Twitter that it was some Golovotyapstvo, as she said. Golovotyapstvo
It was a Kosylov, if I'm not
different.
mistaken.
No, that's her. It's different to translate, but we can translate it as a kind of not very careful management of things, right? And it was increasingly very interesting how Ukrainians were reacting to this, because we have seen several press statements by the Ministry of Defense, by the emergency service, which were extremely full of humor. I mean, I don't remember when official institutions in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world were communicating in that way. So, for example, these ministries would be saying, "Okay, be careful on your objects," addressing Russians.
So don't smoke in the areas when you're not allowed to.
Exactly, and similar communication was from the emergencies agency. So it was a trolling. So the Ukrainian public institutions communicate in the way of trolling towards Russians, and this is very interesting. So really interesting how both sides are denying it. And this is kind of a very interesting Zugzwang, because Russians cannot accept that the Ukrainians have hit the bases, because it will mean they're very weak. Their air defense system is very weak. And Ukrainians are playing on this because, as if Ukraine does not really attack Russian territory, and even Crimea, which of course Ukraine considers as Ukrainian territory. And there was a statement from UK defense minister who would be saying that it is perfectly legitimate for Ukraine to attack Crimea.
Yeah, but what is extremely important in this context, that for many, many times Russia, I mean Putin, but also Medvedev, were underlining that Crimea is a red line. So before the war started, let's come back to the autumn 2021 and see how Putin, if I'm not mistaken, it was after his meeting with Emmanuel Macron. He was making his press conference, and he was justifying this, his demand, for example, for Ukraine not to enter NATO, because he was stating that if imagine then Ukraine will attack military, in a military way, they will attack Crimea, and we will have a war with NATO. So for them, the Crimea is the sacred place, and do anything but don't touch Crimea. And Medvedev, former president of Russia, was stating many, many times that if only you touch Crimea, you will see a disaster. You will see, he was just hinting there will be a big disaster, in the global disaster, if only Ukrainians dare to approach Crimea. But what we see, and this is extremely shocking, Ukrainians, we don't know how, but we can presume that Ukrainians hit this military base, and Russia can do nothing. They just do nothing. They just don't react. They just deny that, and there is no strike, no response. They are incapable of response, and this is something which I think that might change this war.
We will see. I mean, I do not agree that there is no response. There is constant shelling of Ukrainian territories every night.
Yeah, but this is not a response.
And, for example, on the next day, we have seen huge shelling of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and there were over 10 people died. But after the strike, there were already satellite images published who showed that, I think, from 7 to 9, how much? 10, about 10 fighter jets. Russian fighter jets were destroyed, which is huge. I mean, in one single strike, you just destroy 10 fighter jets. And we have seen also the panic among the people in Crimea, among the Russian tourists, so among the dwellers of Crimea. They really collected all the things and tried to leave the peninsula through the Kerch Bridge. And there were traffic jams not only before this Kerch Bridge, but as far as we see from the videos posted by these Crimean people, by Russians, of course, mostly on Telegram channels, these traffic jams were from as far as Simferopol, from the central Crimea.
As to damage caused by this strike, experts are talking about from 9 up to maybe 20 jets which were destroyed. But even more importantly, what we know, the information was published in Russian Telegram channels. We cannot confirm that, but they were talking about around 60 died and more than 100 were wounded. But most importantly, among these people, there were Russian pilots, so highly qualified military, and some professionals linked to this airbase. And talking about pilot, this is very important because in order to form a pilot, you need years. You cannot just this is a kind of education. You need years, in fact. So this is a huge damage to what Russia had in Crimea. They still have some other air bases in Crimea, but it seemed that this one in Novofedorivka was the most important one, and they were really using these jets in order to control the air in the southern Ukraine, but also to bombard. I mean, they were sending missiles from these jets to the whole territory of Ukraine, so hopefully we'll see a little bit less attacks in the coming days. We're not sure, but this damage is real. This is compared to what happened with Moscow in April. So this is a huge attack on Russian reputation.
And indeed, this can be kind of a psychological breakthrough for Ukrainians that can be attacking the key positions of Russians in occupied Crimea, in newly occupied territories, but also on Russian territory or Belarusian territory. There was also an explosion in Belarus. Also, we don't know what happened. So this is kind of a fog in the war. Ukrainians do not confirm that they are doing this, but maybe this is continuation of the same story.
This time this was in Zaporizhzhia in Belarus, and yes, indeed, there were kind of explosions, lightnings in the night, around 8 or 9 explosions like that. But once again, like in case with Crimea, there were no official confirmation from Lukashenko stating that Ukrainians attacked, but there was a communication coming from Ukrainian officials stating that if only you are preparing some provocations, maybe for the Independence Day, for 24th of August, or you are preparing shelling or missiles, anything can happen. So it was kind of hint coming from Ukrainian side stating that, look, we are strong enough to get to your air bases.
You see what is the paradox? In Ukraine, there is a meme of Lukashenko justifying that Russia and his army will has made a preventive strike against Ukraine. Like he'll be telling Putin, I will show you where the Ukrainian attack was coming from. Everybody laughs on this meme. It's one of the most popular meme right now in Ukraine. But look at the paradox. When Ukrainians were not even thinking of attacking Belarus, of course, everybody understands that this is bullshit, right? And Belarus just has given territory for Russian troops to attack Ukraine. This led to attack on Kyiv, on Bucha, on Hostomel, to war crimes, to the cases of genocide in Bucha, for example, etc. So when Ukrainians were not intending to attack Belarusian military bases, Lukashenko was saying they were intending. When Ukrainians probably attacked them, Lukashenko is silent. Interesting.
Yeah, and what is important is the same story as with Crimea. So that's why we might presume that maybe we are talking about about the change in this war, because Ukrainian army is getting stronger. We don't know exactly which warfare was used in both attacks, so if it was used or not, it was a kind of operation maybe on the ground. We don't know that. But what we do understand is that Ukrainians are getting stronger, and it might change the following of this war.
Very briefly on two other news we will talk. One of the news is that Russians are preparing a kind of a tribunal against the Ukrainian prisoners of war, against people who defended Azovstal, against our warriors from the Azov battalion. And it seems that they're preparing really a kind of a process, a show trial in a Stalinist model. So we can check the show trials of 1936, 1937, and if we're talking about Ukraine, it was even earlier, from the 1930 it started these repressions. So Russians are preparing this, and it goes contrary all the agreements brokered, but also by international institutions like the International Committee of the Red Cross, that these people taken as prisoners of war in Mariupol, they will be exchanged for Russian prisoners. We have seen that Russians have killed over 50 Ukrainian prisoners of war in Olenivka with the big explosion in the place they were located, and now they seem to make a show trial. And I will not be surprised, and they will, for example, the occupation of authorities of the so-called DNR and LNR will decide that they will be execute them. So they will decide to execute them.
We don't know exactly. Yes, let's hope it will not be the case. They still have some reasons to keep these people, to exchange them or to use them is in order to change other things. But unfortunately, what we know at that moment is that they are preparing this show for the 24th of August, so for the Independence Day here in Ukraine, and it could really spoil the day for millions, because for Ukrainians, defenders of Azovstal are heroes without any exaggeration. And it was extremely painful for Ukrainians to see how cynically Russia killed 53 defenders of Azovstal in Olenivka, and if they continue to do so with others, I mean, making this show, they will be placed in cages in this philharmony in Mariupol. So it'll be a kind of an absurd show for people who would think that they are Nazis, they are radicals. I don't know exactly what will be. We do know what the narrative will be. They will be accusing them of being unhuman, of being Nazis, which is completely not true. But I would say it will be very painful for Ukraine to observe that, and unfortunately, there are not a lot of possibilities for Ukraine to stop that, because Ukraine does not have any access to Mariupol. There will be no room for any kind of special operation, and unfortunately, once again, Russia will use that to maintain this psychological pressure on Ukrainian authorities, on Ukrainian government, on Ukrainian president, and on Ukrainian people.
Yes, and of course we can expect lots of humiliation, the crazy crowd that they will spit on people, and yes, as you said, say they are Nazis and fascists and wherever else. And unfortunately, all we know about Russian captivities in the southern Ukraine, that people really suffer from tortures and from deportations, from filtration camps. This is all reality in the 21st century. Let me refer to an analysis made by, we have made several times on our website, UkraineWorld, about the situation in the south. For example, our recent interview with Maria Tomak, Ukrainian human rights defender. So the last thing is the discussion about the visas for Russians. And that's a very interesting discussion, because the question arises, Russians cannot fly to Europe, although there is Wizz Air that seems to restore the flights. But at the same time, At the same time, Russians can enter Europe, European Union, and sometimes they organize provocations. And interestingly, there was a recent statement by Mr. Medvedev that you mentioned, who is now notorious for his crazy statements. And one of it was on his Telegram channel, is that, again, coming back to this Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant in Enerhodar, and he would be saying that Ukrainians are shelling this power plant, but Ukrainians are saying that this is contingencies. And Medvedev continues, well, EU should think about EU-based nuclear power plants because there can be some contingencies there as well. Yeah. So this was a clear threat of a kind of a nuclear terrorism that Russian citizens can do in the EU countries. So the question is that, and we have seen this Russian terrorist attacks in Salisbury, in Czech Republic, and these people entered the European Union on tourist visas.
Yes, indeed. But there is also another aspect of that. So at that very moment, more than 10 European countries have already introduced this ban for visas, for tourist visas at least. First of all, Baltic countries, some other countries, northern countries, some countries like, for example, Germany. There was a statement of Olaf Scholz stating that we will not do that because for us this is a Putin's war, this is not Russia's war. And immediately there was a response from Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs stating that look at the sociology polls and just see that almost 80% of Russians support the war. So this is an aspect of security for Europeans. And it's not a surprise why Baltic states started this story, because most of Russians, they enter, because there is no flights, almost no flight, they are entering Europe through Baltic states, through Estonia, Lithuania, etc. So another aspect, it is about a collective responsibility. How Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, stated yesterday that Europe is not a supermarket where everybody can come and everybody is accepted if he pays. So if Russians are able to pay, I don't know, in Paris, in Berlin, or in Rome, it doesn't mean that we will let them in, because this is about the responsibility of the whole people, Russians as a people, for what is going on. Because during 20 years of Putin in power, they still had time to do something with that. And this is not just to make only Ukrainians pay this horrible price for this Putin's madness. So in a way, there will be some restrictions for the people, I mean, for Russian people, unfortunately, but also for those who don't support war. But this is a way to push them to action, because Europeans are suffering from this war with sanctions. Americans are suffering with this war. Everybody, Ukrainians, first of all, are suffering from this war. Nobody in Russia can say, I have nothing to do with that. This is not my fault. I'm against the war, so I'm not responsible. Why couldn't I still travel in Europe as I did before? So this is about, once again, we are touching the sensitive point of collective responsibility for this war, and this visas restriction can be analyzed in this context as well.
Yes, of course, we should. We are not the bloody, thirsty people, and we understand that, for example, in Russia, the political climate is becoming horrible. So it should not be as in Soviet Union, when you basically cannot leave the country, and if you are a human rights activist, you are just condemned to die in the camps. And I think the approach should be very smart. So tourist visa, yes, they should be restricted, and there should be cases when, for example, for social reasons, for health reasons, people are allowed, of course, to enter European Union with Russian passports. But there should be some action, because indeed this is not Putin's war. This is a war widely supported by the Russian society. Not everybody is guilty, of course. There are people who are very brave in Russia and try to oppose it and help Ukrainians and do what they can. but there is a certain big support, unfortunately, for this war, and there should be also instruments to change it, and this can be one of the instruments to change it, to make ordinary Russian feel that it is simply, this war is not in his or her interest, for example, right? Though this was our analysis of this week. This was a podcast explaining Ukraine, a product by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the oldest and biggest Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld. My co-host is Tetyana Ogarkova, who works for Ukraine Crisis Media Center. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We spend the majority of your support to help people affected by this war, to do our volunteer trips to the villages destroyed by this war, to towns, to cities, and to the front line. You can listen to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, on Google, Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.